let's jump right into this explainer. You know, when we usually picture the master of suspense, we tend to imagine this dark, brooding genius, right? Just constantly surrounded by the macabre. But actually, scratch that. The real truth behind how Alfred Hitchcock engineered the most enduring psychological thrillers of all time is way more calculated, intensely structured, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than the myths. Today, we're going to break down the exact rules and blueprints he used to literally terrify audiences across the globe. So here's a paradox that completely reorients how we look at his creative process. How on earth does a man who lived a life of ultimate predictability, a guy who actively avoided any kind of physical exertion or surprise, manage to tap so deeply into the universal well of human terror? I mean, the contrast is just wild. On one hand, you have the real Hitchcock. He basically operated like a civil servant. He'd wake up at 7 a.m. sharp, have his tea, toss on one of his 6 identical blue suits, and spend his evenings doing the dishes with his wife of 40 years, while their tiny miniature cilium snoozed nearby. But then, on the other hand, you have the world he built in his mind, this chaotic, shadowy realm just teeming with spies, assassins, and blackmailers. Because his everyday reality was so profoundly mundane, he was able to channel all of that dark, stylized energy directly onto the screen. All right, part 1, the anti-literary visual mind. Let's look at how that mundane lifestyle translated into his craft, starting with his total rejection of traditional literature. Hitchcock had a fundamentally anti-literary mind. He literally said he'd rather just show it himself with a camera. When he read a book, he was instinctively asking himself one single question: is this going to make a movie or not? Flowery, elaborate descriptions of a city street, they completely bored him because he knew he could just show it. In fact, he mostly stuck to reading contemporary biographies and travel books just to avoid getting bogged down in literary style. For him, cinema had to be purely, uncompromisingly visual. The really crucial takeaway here is that Hitchcock looked at an empty movie house and an empty screen and saw a magnetic challenge. He didn't start with the plot content. He started with the container. He viewed the screen as an empty receptacle just waiting to be charged with emotion. He wasn't simply telling a story, he was designing a highly calibrated delivery system for sensations. Every single camera angle, every shadow, was engineered to fill that empty space with a specific, targeted emotional hit. Moving right along to part 2, psychology and the rising curve. This brings us to his rigid rules for storytelling, which he really dug into during his famous discussions with the director François Truffaut. Hitchcock was absolutely obsessed with what he called the rising curve. It's this incredibly strict narrative structure that just continually escalates dramatic suspense, and he absolutely refused to compromise it. He pointed out that sure, European art house films might hit pause for some philosophical introspection or character detours, but in a suspense story, no way. A stalling plot is totally inadmissible. The forward momentum literally cannot break. So what exactly is he pulling along that rising curve? Well, he called them his nighttime anxieties. Hitchcock can care less about what he considered daytime preoccupations, things like unemployment or everyday romance. He thought those were pictorially dull. Instead, he dealt strictly in the visceral, metaphysical stuff: primal fear, sex, death, and fetishism. Take Marnie, for example. He completely stripped the story down to its lowest common denominator, treating it as a twisted, fetishistic tale of a prince and a beggar girl. These are the themes that keep you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. But even the master struggled with this balance sometimes. Truffaut astutely pointed out a structural tension in Marnie. When you mix the slow pace of a psychological investigation with the urgent speed of a police hunt, the viewer gets a bit confused. They aren't sure if they're rooting for the character to unlock their trauma or just outrun the cops. It kind of disrupts that perfect rising curve. Hitchcock's response to that was just classic, blunt Hitchcock. He knew exactly what a mass audience would swallow. For instance, he actually wanted to give Sean Connery's character a much more explicit, fetishistic motive in Marnie. He wanted us to hear the guy's internal thoughts about wanting to catch the girl stealing just so he could possess her. But he didn't do it because he knew the public would flat out reject it. They'd say, "Oh no, that's not right. I don't buy it." He was always calculating exactly how far he could push us without breaking our trust. Let's move to part 3, subverting the murder cliché. Hitchcock was a total fanatic for geographical progression. Take Paul Newman's escape route in his 1966 film Torn Curtain. Get this. Hitchcock didn't just map that out in some cozy writer's room. He actually flew the exact route himself beforehand, taking a Romanian airline from Copenhagen to East Berlin, over to Leipzig, and eventually Sweden.
He literally had to inhabit the exact physical container his characters would be in to make sure the geography of the suspense was bulletproof. And once inside that container, he loved messing with our expectations, especially with violence. He was so sick of that fast-paced Hollywood stabbing cliché where a killer effortlessly dispatches someone in 2 seconds. For the famous Gromek farmhouse murder, he wanted to show that, actually, killing a man silently is agonizingly difficult, painful, and super messy. The killers couldn't make a sound, so they had to sequentially grab whatever household objects were nearby, blinding him with a kettle of soup, breaking a carving knife on his collarbone, beating him with a shovel, and finally dragging his head to a gas oven. It's a masterpiece of brutal realism.
But these rigid, mechanical rules definitely caused some on-set friction. Enter Paul Newman. Newman was a classic method actor. He wanted to emote, he really wanted to feel the scene. But Hitchcock demanded a neutral look. See, his entire point of view editing style relied on the actor having a blank face, so he could cut to what they were looking at and let the audience project the emotion. Newman's emotive style just didn't give him those visual anchors. So what did Hitchcock do? He simply took an expensive, fully completed factory scene and tossed it straight into the trash. Which brings us perfectly to part 4, the cutting room floor. You'll learn a ton about his boundaries by looking at the projects that never survived his intense filtering process. Take The Three Hostages. It featured a villain using hypnotism. Hitchcock dropped it because he realized hypnotism on screen just looks like an actor faking it. It's too remote from our own experiences and shatters the illusion instantly. Or RRR, an Italian script he dumped because it was too slipshod and shapeless. If a story didn't have that tight rising curve, or if it broke our trust in reality, he just wouldn't shoot it. But even for the films he didn't end up making, like the ghost story Mary Rose, his visual problem-solving was just completely unparalleled. How do you shoot a ghost without it looking like a cheap trick? He figured it out. Put the actress in a dark gray dress, hide a neon tube of light inside the hem, make sure she casts absolutely no shadows on the wall, and use a blue light so she comes across as a sensation rather than a solid human body. I mean, that is a masterclass in visual engineering for a movie that doesn't even exist. Finally, part 5, cinema as universal language. At the end of the day, all of these meticulous rules served one massive, overarching purpose. Hitchcock saw cinema as the ultimate universally translatable language. Think about it. A novel loses nuance in translation. A play changes every single night. But a film travels the globe intact. He firmly believed that if you engineer the container properly, if you hit those emotional triggers with absolute precision, the Japanese audience should scream at the exact same millisecond as the Indian audience. That was his ultimate triumph, programming a universal human reflex. And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Hitchcock proved definitively that our deepest, darkest fears aren't just personal, they're universally shared. And more importantly, they can be mechanically triggered by a master visual engineer. Which really makes you wonder, as we stare into the empty receptacles of today's screens, how exactly are they being filled? What new nighttime anxieties are modern filmmakers quietly programming us to feel? Keep that in mind the next time you find yourself at the edge of your seat. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning what you see on the screen.